Good afternoon, everybody. So I am going to kick us off for this afternoon in this session on football governance, and I'm going to cover 4 topics. The ECJ decision in respect of FIFA and UEFA arising from the European Super League, the League and FIFPro action against FIFA, recent cases under the Premier League's financial rules, and finally, I will outline the main provisions of the Football Regulator Bill before I'm joined by the panel. So starting with the ECJ case against FIFA and UEFA arising out of the European Super League. Now, cross-border competitions such as the proposed ESL require authorization by both UEFA and FIFA. And when the ESL was mooted, UEFA threatened to impose sanctions on any clubs and players who participated in it. There was a big fallout from the ESL, as you know, but 3 clubs remained in it, and they launched proceedings in Madrid, arguing that FIFA's and UEFA's rules in this regard were contrary to EU law. The Spanish court sought a preliminary ruling from the ECJ on certain aspects of EU law. And here's what the ECJ found. Firstly, inter-club competitions and the exploitation of media rights arising from them are economic activities, and they must therefore comply with EU competition law and respect freedom of movement. This is not new law. The court then noted that both FIFA and UEFA are competition organisers in their own right. And the court found they were in a dominant position in the market because they could determine the conditions on which potential competitors, i.e. other competitions, could access the market. And the ECJ went on to say that any regulations which make any new competition subject to their approval must contain substantive criteria for making the decision and be transparent, objective, non-discriminatory, and proportionate. And if there are 4 words I'd like you to take away from this brief 10 minutes, it is those. Transparent, objective, non-discriminatory, and proportionate. Guardrails for anyone tasked with drafting sports governance and regulatory frameworks. Carrying on, the ECJ said that if rules do not comply with those criteria, they are unlawful as an abuse of dominant position and anti-competitive. And the finding of fact was that the existing UEFA and FIFA rules governing cross-border competitions did not comply with this test and were therefore unlawful. We need to see what the impact of this case will be, and for me, its significance lies not in whether or not there'll be a European Super League, although it does make the gateway to the pathway for a European Super League a little easier. But in my opinion, this is one of the most significant judicial interventions in football since the Bosman ruling. The question is the extent to which we will see further challenges to UEFA and FIFA and how they conduct themselves as dominant undertakings, and whether this will extend beyond the narrower issue of authorising other competitions. This case, the second of my topics today, may be one such case. In October 2024, the Association of European Leagues and FIFPro, the World Players' Union, lodged a complaint against FIFA at the European Commission. Their allegations are firstly that FIFA has abused its dominant position and breached EU competition law, and secondly, that it has a conflict of interest because it is both a governing body and a competition organiser. And you may be aware, that as a competition organiser, FIFA has increased in size both its Club World Cup, Men's Club World Cup, from 7 to 32 clubs, and its Men's World Cup from 32 to 48 nations. The leagues and FIFA Pro say that the impact of this is unsustainable impact on player health, well-being and career longevity, because they are having to play more games, and a threat to the economic and social sustainability and stability of important national competitions. Now, as I say, this complaint was lodged 6 months ago. We don't have an outcome or any news, but it's definitely one to watch. Turning to domestic matters, the past year or so have seen a series of cases, both disciplinary and arbitral, under the Premier League's financial rules. Firstly, I've summarised here the 4 disciplinary decisions that were reached in respect of clubs alleged to have breached what's called the PSR rules, profitability and sustainability. And the critical provision here is that under those rules, clubs are not allowed to make losses beyond a certain capped figure. And the allegation against these 4 clubs was that they had all done so. Now, what we're beginning to see is emerging jurisprudence about what is the appropriate sanction when those rules have been breached, and you will see that points deductions come into play. In 10 minutes, I can give you no more than an introduction to these cases. They're all available on the Premier League's website and do provide interesting study to see how disciplinary commissions and appeal boards arrived at their sanctions. Just to note, with Leicester, they were cleared because their financial period ended on the 30th of June 2023, by which point they were no longer legally a member of the Premier League. There was a finding that the Premier League had no jurisdiction. Moving on, we have also seen arbitration about these rules from Manchester City, who challenged what's called the associated party transaction aspects of these rules. And what these say is that any transaction between a club and an associated party must be marked to fair market value to avoid a hidden or a side subsidy from ultimate owners into the club. To cut this short and quickly, the key point here is that Manchester City won on 3 points, of which the most significant is the first bullet point there, that the arbitral panel found that shareholder loans, i.e. usually interest-free loans from an owner into a club, must be included in the assessments of associated party transactions. There was a second finding that meant that the whole of the APT regime, as it is known, was unenforceable. And this may be a distinction without a difference, because in November the Premier League amended those rules and they remain in place. However, Manchester City has issued a new arbitral challenge to those revised rules. This is no more than legal gossip, don't set your store by it, but that may be heard in mid-October of this year. So another one to watch. And my 4th topic is the Football Governance Bill. This bill had completed its House of Lords stages and had its second reading in the Commons this week. It will regulate men's clubs in leagues to be determined, but likely to be the top 5 professional leagues. Here's the government's policy background rationale for it, that its introduction is a response to a number of events which have highlighted systemic issues and concerns about self-regulation, citing the liquidation of Bury FC in 2019, the attempt to join the European Super League, and unspecified issues concerning club identity, heritage, and existence. The government's supporting arguments, and these tend to be the arguments adopted by all those who argue for the regulator, are that it's necessary to ensure the long-term sustainability and resilience of English football. It will reform the governance culture of the game, and it will mitigate the risk of what the government describes as clubs being lost, with specific objectives around financial soundness, financial resilience, and heritage. The counter-arguments, such as they are, run like this: that there have been 6 Premier League and EFL club insolvencies in the past 10 years and none in the past 4. That the government's intention, and this is clear, is not to de-risk football entirely and in any way warrant or guarantee that there will be 0 club insolvencies going forward. So what is the KPI? If 6 in 10 years is too many and 0 is not what we're aiming for, it must be between 1 and 5. And that the European Super League, the arguments continue, and heritage issues are already effectively regulated by football, plus bureaucracy, cost, etc. How will a club get a licence? Well, they have to comply with 3 things: mandatory licence requirements, threshold requirements, and meet the freestanding rules. And I'll just go on to those quickly. These are the mandatory licence requirements: submit and comply with financial plans, consult with your fans, provide a corporate governance statement showing how you're applying the new governance code, and alert the regulator of any changes. The threshold requirements are set out as principles in the bill. The regulator will provide further detail. Broadly, the club has to show that it has appropriate financial and non-financial resources for its operations and planned activities, and it does fan engagement well. And the freestanding duties, these are many, and I've tried to pick out the main ones here. The 2 that exercise me a little bit are probably the second one, that the regulator will have to prior approve, before employment, football club's senior management, okay? And the regulator has to be satisfied that they are competent, financially sound, and honest. I don't think there's any suggestion that clubs are not capable of taking these recruitment decisions themselves, and that football's club management is a perfectly competent, honest, and financially sound workforce. So I'm not sure what problem we're trying to solve with that. And then from a legal perspective, at the bottom, insolvency only appoint an administrator with the regulator's approval. And I'm puzzled how that sits with directors' duties under the Companies Act, the Insolvency Act, because when you need to appoint a regulator, an administrator, you need to appoint an administrator. Anyway, I'm a little over time, but I hope that gives you a bit of an introduction to what I'm sure will be a very lively panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for outlining the key areas. And now we're going to have a heated debate on precisely those key areas and others as well. So now we can welcome to the stage the rest of our panel. Nick Craig is the Chief Operating Officer of the English Football League, the EFL, a qualified solicitor who's working at the EFL and has been for 23 years now. He oversees the development and implementation of the EFL owners and directors test. So it's all your fault, Nick. It's all we're going to get into that in just a moment. And also the related acquisition of control rules. Kieran Maguire, now star of Stage and Screen and BBC Sport websites and everything else, he's the go-to guy. So if anything goes wrong in terms of football finance, then Kieran is already across it, knows everything about it, and is able to explain it in a very clear and concise way to us members of the public, which is very handy. He's football finance lecturer at the University of Liverpool. He contributed to the fan-led review into football governance, led by Tracy Crouch, and he's also co-host of the Price Football podcast, and he's a Brighton and Hove Albion fan, so that's a lot of commuting up and down the railways of Great Britain to Liverpool and back. And Nick DeMarco, KC, leading sports law barrister, as many of you will be aware, with Blackstone Chambers. Hello, Nick. Nick acts for national and international federations, as well as the Premier League and international football clubs, and he also sits as an arbitrator across a number of sports. Welcome to our wonderful panel. Great job. Well, first of all, Kieran, I've given you the big build-up as to the man who can break things down for everybody as to why things are the way they are and perhaps how they should be. Could you first start us off? We'll talk about the independent regulator to start with, the pros and cons of that, and then afterwards we'll kind of prod you a little bit more closely for your actual opinion on whether it's a good idea or not, but just how it's due to work.
I think the pros of the independent regulator is that it can act on a holistic basis rather than sort of in what's narrowly in the best of an individual club in an individual league in an individual season. It can take into account the views of other stakeholders than owners, who ultimately are the shareholders and the people that are charging direction for the game, and it can act as a buffer, as a protection from the attempts of a domestic coup of the game that we saw in Project Big Picture 4 years ago, the Super League, which we saw 3 years ago, and attempts by owners to have matches taking place overseas, all of which have a very negative impact on the stakeholder group, which is that of fans. So I think those are the main advantages. And in theory, what it can do is, I think the big issue, which I suspect Nick will be expanding upon later, is that there is no agreement between the Premier League and the EFL with regards to a revised distribution deal for the money which comes into football. The Premier League's superbly successful. Nobody's denying that. The EFL, I've got the figures here. EFL revenue's up 1,100% since the inception of the Premier League. Inflation's up 120. Fantastic achievement. That's 9 times faster than inflation. You've got the Premier League revenues up 3,000%. It's the greatest achievement which has created the greatest problem. So getting those two parties, if they can't agree to force through a deal, then that is a potential benefit. The downsides, you've got costs. Those costs have to be absorbed by the industry. There's no way that the public purse should do that. The potential for politicization of the regulator, as opposed to it being truly independent, that could be called into question. And also, one of the accusations will be, could it have a negative impact upon investment as far as new people coming into the game? So those are the pluses and minuses.
Okay. And your personal opinion?
I'm in favour of a regulator out of sorrow rather than joy. Do I want a regulator? No. If the Football Association had done its job properly, it should be the regulator, but it doesn't want that role. If clubs could agree to talk to each other on a more civil matter, if they can get round the table and thrash out a deal, then I don't think we would need a regulator. We've also got not only civil war between the Premier League and the EFL, you've got civil war within the Premier League itself. It's become increasingly factionalised, and decisions are being made which now you can't get deals over the line, which is actually holding the game back. Here the regulator potentially could be of benefit. But I think those are all solvable if people talk and people agree to make compromises.
But is the big problem here that football is riddled with self-interest, Nick?
Yes, that is the big problem. And I think that's the reason of standing back rationally as sports lawyers. Many of us think that the idea of an independent regulator is a good idea, because there's a continuum between some of the things Jane discussed, those ECJ cases, about the problem with the regulator also being the rights holder. And in football, there's a problem with the clubs voting for their own rules. So a few years ago, I spent most of my time, Nick just reminded me, Nick Craig, cross-examining Nick Craig, because there were a number of cases between different championship football clubs. Depending on what stage of the cycle they were in, they wanted to either invest more or stop others investing more. And then they would vote for rules which served their short-term interests. And we're now seeing that played out in the Premier League. And that's the problem with self-regulation, and why an independent regulator is a good idea. But on the other hand, it seems to me we shouldn't be killing the golden goose. The Premier League is the most successful football league in the world, the most successful, arguably, sporting product in the world. The reason that is the case is because there is such great jeopardy in football and in the Premier League compared to other leagues. Who would have thought that Nottingham Forest or Newcastle might end up third or even better this year? And we shouldn't have rules or regulations that prevent that. Now, I don't think the regulator will prevent that. I think the real problem is we currently have rules that bake in the status quo. And those rules are the financial fair play rules, various emanations of them, which mean, for example, a club like Luton Town could never invest a fraction of what Manchester United could, so there can never be fair competition. And probably parachute payments, which is where the independent regulator comes in, and where we've got the situation this year, unfortunately, the 3 clubs going down from the Premier League are the 3 that went up last year.
Again,
and
same as last
probably
time.
again, and probably the 3 going up will be, we already know 2 out of the 3 will be those who went down last year. And that is undermining that jeopardy, which is a key thing that I think sells the Premier League and English football as a whole. And we need to make sure that that is not undermined, but the shortcomings of the regulator is it has said it's going to wash its hands of all that financial regulation. It's going to step back, even though it's there for sustainability, and allow the leagues to continue to regulate themselves in terms of PSR rules or P&S rules. And in that sense, I think it may not change much at all.
Interesting. So, Nick, you as our EFL representative here on this panel, we know are very much in favour of the independent regulator. You feel that the flow of money down from the Premier League would be greater under a new regulator. Is that right? And how do you think it should work?
That's not our starting point. Our starting point is that our 72 clubs are woven into the fabric of this society, okay? There'll be people out there, me included, okay? We're supporters of our local teams. 87% of the population lives within 15 miles of an EFL club. We've been going since 1888, okay? It's part of the fabric of the life. And what we are trying to do is always work towards having clubs which are sustainable, because we know what the impact is of a community losing its club. And that's why we're actually primarily supportive of the principle of financial regulation, because we do want these clubs to continue. We want them to thrive. We do want a successful Premier League. Equally, we want a successful EFL. You know, we have one of the strongest pyramids of domestic football throughout the world, and that's why we are so successful. And we want to keep that going. There is the inevitable challenges that we've got. We've touched on it there already, but the reality is that no matter how successful the EFL and the Championship in particular can be in terms of generating its own revenues, raising its own profile through our broadcast sponsorships here and abroad, you cannot bridge the gap that there is to the Premier League. The Premier League, being so successful, faces the challenges of the clubs that get relegated from the Premier League have financial commitments which are significant. And they need the help in order to make that transition as they move down through the pyramid as well, which is why we have parachute payments. If we put it into context, though, the 3 clubs that receive parachute payments receive more in total than the rest of the clubs of the EFL receive in solidarity. And it's that financial imbalance in the Championship that means that we're beginning to see this distorted competition that we've got today. And it's that gap between the Championship and the Premier League that means that the 3 clubs that go up invariably may well be the 3 clubs that come down. And it has happened twice now. And that's not going to be good for the Premier League either. So what the EFL is saying is that if the price of a financial reset of the game to address those systemic issues is an element of independent regulation, that also helps make sure that clubs are sustainable and will survive in their communities, then that's the price that's worth paying.
Yeah, so we mentioned that for the last couple of years, the 3 clubs that went up came straight back down. It should also be pointed out that 3 years ago, 3 clubs that came up have stayed up and thrived. So they are Bournemouth, who've gone on to do really well. They're Nottingham Forest, who are pushing for Champions League football, and Fulham as well, who are establishing themselves as well. So it's not every year that this happens, just to clarify. Jane, what's your view on this?
Well, I think, firstly, I would say to our parliamentarians, you've got to scrutinise this legislation incredibly carefully, regardless of the strategic issues. As I've highlighted in my introduction, there are some drafting problems to the point where some of the sections, that bit about pre-approving for employment football's management, I laid a bet with Nick last night. I said it'll get enacted, but it will never be brought into force, because only after it's enacted will people realise what's on the statute book and how unenforceable it is. More broadly, there are a couple of good things in there. I like the idea of a governance code for clubs. Those of you who know me know I'm a bit of a fan of governance codes. I can understand there needs to be a mechanism somehow, if the leagues can't agree to bring a bit of stick to that discussion and say get on with it. My preference, when I'm years too late with this, I wish I'd had this idea earlier, is I would have liked to see football set up something like a kind of professional game regulatory authority modelled on PGMOL, the referees body, where the three main stakeholders are three equal partners in it, modelled also on something called PJAC that Nick and I sit on the board of. Again, the three main football stakeholders are the three partners in it. And that body could still have been owned by football, run by football, with perhaps sufficient independence built in at board level, maybe some obligations around transparency and reporting to government, being questioned by government what they were up to. And it would have ensured regulatory consistency between the two leagues, treatment, because they have the same rule books. The two leagues have broadly the same rule books. It could have answered some of the issues that have been risen about trust in the process and sufficient independence. So, you know, I sometimes have ideas, but years too late. So there we go. But that would be my preference.
Well, so you had the idea, but we did it.
Oh, did you?
Because what we did was we introduced the Independent Club Financial Reporting Unit within the EFL. But rather than giving the board of the EFL oversight of the work of that unit, we established an Independent Club Financial Reporting Panel. The reason why we did that is because the board of the EFL, we're a stakeholder organisation. We've got 6 club representatives on our board plus some independent non-executive directors. And it was always a challenge if you were having to report to the board about matters relating to other clubs as to whether individual directors were conflicted, whether a division's directors were conflicted or not. And we felt that it was necessary to take that away. So we established the team of accountants who would do the legwork on the oversight of the club finances, but their reports would go into this completely independent club financial reporting panel. And we wanted the Premier League to join us with that. They chose not to, but it's the principle that you were talking about,
Yeah,
Jane.
it absolutely is,
And we've
yeah.
done that because we felt it was important to take away that, Nick would call it vested interest, at board level, and it could have the potential to infect decisions, he would say. I obviously said it never did, but we've taken away the doubt by doing what we've done. And by doing that, you introduce that independence. It would be much better, I think, if there was one body that then oversaw the same rules. Similarly with regards to the owners and directors test as well, but certainly the financial rules, especially where you have the movement of clubs between divisions. So, and as Jane touched on, the regulator's not going to do cost control rules. It's only going to do licensing. It's going to do the sustainability tests. Have you got enough money in order to be able to operate? And one of the challenges that EFL clubs are going to have with that is that, our owners are probably going to have to put in £450 million this season in order to be able to meet the commitments that they've entered into just to try and compete. And being able to satisfy the regulator that that's going to continue is going to be a challenge. But that's why we say regulation has to come with redistribution.
Kieran, you touched on the potential politicisation of independent regulator. There have been suggestions as to who might take over and who might head it up. Is there just going to be criticism of whoever takes it over? Can anybody be truly independent? And can they, frankly, can they rise above any kind of criticism for potential perceived bias?
I think after the England football manager, this is going to be the toughest job in the game. It's certainly in terms of being able to persuade people that they are acting in the broader interests of the game as a whole. So I think it will be a challenge. And how do you measure success? I mean, I was on another panel last night where the regulator's name was confirmed. So David Cogan is the preferred choice and will be sitting. Dame Caroline spoke about there's going to be a DCMS committee where the candidates will have to promote themselves to see whether they will be finally approved. So if you've got an individual who comes from a broadcasting background, then the critics will say they're going to do what's best in the interest of broadcasters. If that person is also a contributor to the current government, then they will be seen as being a political appointee. So it's an impossible job, but I think you've also got to be seen to be independent as well as being an independent, and this first step will provoke a lot of pushback.
I think there's plenty of broadcasters who think that David did not act in their best interest by virtue of the rights fees they paid for the Premier League when he acted for them.
I mean, the fact is, it is not an independent football regulator. I think we should drop this word independent from its description because it's a government-appointed football regulator, and therefore I think you're right, and Kieran's touched on it as well, is subject to the views of government, whether hard politics or whatever policy decisions they want to come up with. I like David, I know him as well, I think he's a good guy, but again, this is not an independent appointment, it's a government appointment.
Okay. Nick, your microphone's a little bit, it's gone AWOL. It's drifted down to the Football League.
There we go.
Yeah, if you lift it up a little bit. Gosh, there's so much to unpick in terms of the regulation of football. I mean, and without getting too sort of bogged down with everything, the way that football fans perceive the way football is run at the moment and the directors and whether they should be allowed to be directors. People look at the likes of Reading Football Club, Nick, and they go, well, how on earth was that allowed to happen? And I'm sure you'll be able to explain as to how it's all gone so horribly wrong that this famous old institution has been dragged through the mud because of its owner.
Let's define wrong for a second, okay? So, since coming in, the owner of Reading has spent a huge amount of money in support of Reading Football Club. Yes, certain decisions have been taken which meant it's not achieved the sporting success that the fans would have liked off the back of that kind of investment, maybe what you wouldn't expect off the back of that kind of investment, but nevertheless he has done that. This is one of the systemic issues that the game has got, okay? That the need to continue to fund losses in order to chase performance on the pitch creates issues where sometimes individuals who were very wealthy suddenly become not very wealthy having owned a football club. But the cost base continues to run, and that's something that the regulator is going to have to look at quite carefully. And that's why I say we've got to be mindful that it can't regulate clubs out of competitiveness going forwards. But just to come back to the first point of the question, the owners and directors test is a test of eligibility, not suitability. Okay? And the test was different back in 2017 when they came in compared to where it is now. And they met the requirements of the test. They were not subject to any disqualifying conditions. And if that's the case, then what the rules say is that if you're not subject to a disqualifying condition, you're entitled to take up the role as an owner and director. There's no extra level of, well, okay, you might not be bankrupt, you might not have disqualified directorships, you might not have company insolvencies on your record, but actually, we don't think that you've necessarily got what it takes to own what is ultimately a community asset, so we're going to say no. That was never part of the test, it's not even part of the test today. So on the basis of that, you're left with this situation where individuals can present themselves, and where they tick all the boxes, then provided that they present a credible plan as to how they're going to run the club and demonstrate they've got the funding to do that, then they're entitled to acquire the interest in a club. And that's what they did. And since 2017, they've got there. However, more recently, he's not been able to meet those financial obligations. And that's where the challenge comes.
I entirely agree with Nick Craig on
Sorry,
that.
is that recorded?
No, because I think as lawyers, we have to realise the importance of having hard, objective tests for ownership and control. I mean, it's already bad enough. I know from doing the Newcastle case that these decisions are made often behind closed doors with very little monitoring and accountability of the people making the decisions. But at least the tests are hard, objective tests. They are, whatever they are, but, you know, criminal conviction for dishonesty in a proper court, and so on. You might want to add things to that. But if you have this kind of sniff test, I'm not sure I like the cut of this person's jib or whatever it is, then who's deciding that? How can you review it? And so I think it's very easy when things go wrong to criticize leagues or owners But at the time they were permitted, they fulfilled the requirements, and nothing has been done wrong. And so far as I can read, the independent regulators' tests, what's in the legislation, isn't fundamentally different.
Yeah.
It applies exactly the same hard-edged objective approach as it should.
Yeah,
Well,
I was going to say exactly that. Do not think that this regulator will prevent owners who you may think are running clubs badly. It is, I think the test is based on financial soundness and honesty. I think my notes, I left them over there annoyingly, I did write this down. But that magic word competence, which will apply when looking at whether someone can be the chief marketing officer of Fulchester Rovers, is not in when it comes to owners. They will not be assessing whether they're competent. And I don't know if it's simply a restatement of what's already in the football rulebook. That's a fair
Basically,
summary.
I think it is.
Yeah.
But Kieran, there might be people in this room who maybe don't follow football really closely, but maybe have seen what's happened with Newcastle United and the owners there and the background there, and thinking, well, hang on a minute, how did that get through the regulations?
Is Boris Johnson here? Because he might be able to answer that one.
I don't know, is he? I haven't checked.
As far as Newcastle United were concerned, the Premier League did an investigation. They were satisfied that there was a suitable gap between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Public Investment Fund, which is a part of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And on the basis of that, they approved the deal. And then I think we move into, Nick's spoken about sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability in football? As an accountant, it's the ability to pay your bills as they fall due. If Newcastle United, under the control of the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, cannot pay its bills as they fall due, then I think we've got a much bigger problem in the world economy than Newcastle United itself. Newcastle United, under Mike Ashley, were a sustainable football club in the classic sense. They made profits of £134 million over a 15-year period. Newcastle United, under the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, are not a sustainable business because they've made losses of £188 million in 3 years. Go to Newcastle and ask the public as to what they prefer. As football is not a sustainable business in the traditional viewpoint, but then neither is owning a racehorse, and nobody says that we need to address problems in the horse racing industry. Neither is the America's Cup. How much did that cost the participants? But nobody's saying that that shouldn't take place. Perhaps we need a rethink that I think the traditional way of measuring business success needs to be revisited in football, because football clubs are trophy assets, and therefore it's a hobby. And provided you've still got the funds, and I think the issue, which both Nicks have raised, is the only person who could have been a perfect determinant as to Di Younger being the owner of Reading Football Club would be Doctor Who, because it would require a time machine to be able to go forwards 4 or 5 years to determine that either he couldn't or won't pay the money to pay the bills.
Look, great sponsor on those shirts, though, on the blue and white hoops, wouldn't it? Doctor Who, that'd be phenomenal. Yeah.
I mean, Kieran there talks about it's a trophy asset, but I'll come back to the point that I made right at the start, which is we view them as community assets. But to echo his point about football is not an ordinary business, I asked Nick before we came on stage, where was he on the 24th of May 2014 at 4:45 p.m? And he does remember. He was at Wembley Stadium, because it was the match between Queen's Park Rangers and Derby in the Championship playoff final, ostensibly billed as the richest game in club football in the world, until FIFA built a Club World Cup to give a load of money for bigger clubs anyway. But that was when Bobby Samora scored a goal for QPR, 10 men they were down to, and they had been outplayed. One newspaper article described it as embarrassingly outplayed on that day. That one moment changed the destiny of 2 clubs, because it was that one moment when I looked across at my then chief executive and we both rolled our eyes, because QPR were going to go up to the Premier League in breach of our relatively new financial fair play rules, which was going to leave them with a massive luxury tax. And Mel Morris bought Derby County shortly thereafter.
And it was the most expensive goal QPR have ever scored.
Yes.
Because we then got relegated again, and you charged us with breach of the FFP rules, and it cost tens of millions of pounds.
And that's the business that we're in.
Yeah.
I'm completely and utterly alarmed by the fact that our countdown clock is saying 3.5 minutes, and it feels like we barely scratched the surface. So I'm just going to go straight, Nick, into Manchester City, because again, the public perception is, okay, there are 115 charges hanging over Manchester City, but I would suggest that the public perception is, well, they'll get off because they've got the most expensive lawyers and the best lawyers in the world. Discuss.
That may be what some of the public perceive. It's very difficult for any of us who aren't involved in the case to predict what is going to happen or why it's going to happen. And the reason for that is the hearing is held in private. And anyone who knows me knows that my view is that these sorts of regulatory hearings ought to be held in public. For the same reason that we have court hearings in public in this country, it's to hold judges to account, but it's also to encourage public confidence in the judicial system. And there is enormous public interest in these decisions in football now, proper public interest, and they affect not just one club, but other clubs and all the supporters. And the only way you can really inspire public confidence and get over those perceptions you have is to have public hearings. And now, these days, it wasn't the case 25 years ago when many of us started, nearly all of the decisions of these bodies are published, so why not have a public hearing? There's now no good argument. Of course, sometimes you need exceptions, confidential information and so on, but you have that in the courts. And I think, if I could just plug it here, sport resolutions could play an important role here. Obviously, it's not up for you as facilitators to tell sports governing bodies what rules they should have about these things. But what you can do is at least give the option to those bodies. And it's much easier now. You don't need public galleries or security staff, because you can just put everything on Zoom and have people log in. And in my view, that is the way things are going. We'll see that tendency increase in the next 5 or 10 years, and that's a good thing for sport. The greater transparency and public confidence in football, the better.
And in this particular case, will the public get to see it? And do you think it's potentially even realistic that they will be found guilty of many of these charges? Is it a possibility that Manchester City could get relegated and could lose a number of their trophies and titles in reality?
All of these are possibilities. My own guess, and it's just a guess, is that it's going to be a score draw, and that they'll find some of the perhaps lesser charges against the club and not the greater charges.
Why?
And because the greater charges involve serious dishonesty and fraud and that kind of thing, and they're always more difficult to prove. And my own hope is also it is a score draw, because ultimately it's in the best interests of all of English football, the other clubs, the Premier League, to get together and move on from this civil war situation. And so, Manchester City may or may not end up with a points deduction, but I think relegation and kicking them out of the league is not going to be in anyone's long-term interest.
But if they've grossly breached and blatantly, this is a big if, we don't know, I have no idea, if they have blatantly breached all these regulations, then I would imagine the public would say, well, they should be punished.
Yeah, they may well should be punished, but the extent of that punishment is another question. And of course, Manchester City may not be the only club who are alleged to have done some of these things. There's been stuff in the press about Chelsea and investigations and agreements and so on. And so once you do something so drastic to one club, it makes it more difficult to explain away not applying the same standards to other clubs.
Kieran's nodding away. Oh, Nick's nodding away as well. Questions? Please put your hands up if you... I cannot believe how quickly the time's gone on this. It's crazy. Please do put your hands up if you have questions for any of our panellists. We have 2 microphones roaming around. Oh, you've all got a little bit quiet on this. Really?
There's one back there.
Oh, there's one back there. Yes, good spot. Well done, Nick. Do you know this person? Is this why you've
Yes,
spotted them? He planted. Is a colleague of
I'm
yours.
definitely not a plant. Stuart Brady from Farris Building. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the discussion is the kind of changing geopolitical outlook, because this is inherently quite a geopolitical bill, because main international interlocutors in our Premier League are American and Middle Eastern, both of key strategic importance in a really changing world. Now, you've alighted on a number of challenges with the football governance bill. I wonder whether, and I'd like your opinion on this, a solution might be to have more text in the bill about commencement dates, such that certain elements are held back, such that the game can sort their own house out to commence later on. So, for example, the financial settlement piece probably needs resolution sooner rather than later, but other aspects could come in 2, 3, 4, 5 years or never. So I think that might be quite a neat way of introducing this governance bill in a more proportionate manner, and I'd welcome your view on that.
Want me to have a go at that? I possibly. I don't feel that the bill and what is said around it, you know, governments of both parties, everything they've said around it, does justice to the current regulatory regimes in both leagues. I mean, there's a part in the DCMS briefing notes produced on the 27th of March, which I linked to in my presentation, which actually describes football's current regulation as informal. And when I read that, I literally had to step away because I had such a red mist moment. I mean, those 4 cases I outlined to you, the Manchester City arbitration, the ongoing Manchester City disciplinary case, people in this room have been and are involved in those cases. And I know that as Director of Governance at the Premier League, and I know Nick was my oppo for many years at the EFL, will say the same, we put thought, consideration and damned hard work into getting it right. It is not informal. So while I get the idea and I get where you're coming from, almost a bit like, let's see if you can sort this out yourselves before this becomes binding law, I just have a feeling that the mood music around this isn't particularly respectful, rightly or wrongly, of what football currently does. I may be wrong.
I think just on that, the regulator is engaging with us extensively. They've got a team of people that they're building up. We're having regular meetings with them, and I am reassured by what I hear from those who want to push this forwards. They actually want to work hand in glove with us in terms of so that the regulatory burden on clubs is managed to a reasonable extent. They recognise that clubs are already doing a lot to be able to comply with league financial regulations. And where they can, they want to try and dovetail so that submissions that go into us are sufficient for submissions that go into the regulator or vice versa. I think they'll end up taking priority, obviously, but we'll then try and dovetail with them. So that we've got to do that. I think I agree, you could stagger it in terms of implementation. I think they've said that the State of the Game report, which is going to be fundamental to actually understanding the financial landscape that the game is in, because we're quite some time on from Tracy's review, aren't we, Kieran? It's nearly 3 years now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, you know, we're 3 years on from when the fan-led review was done. You know, we do need that State of the Game report. I think they're saying 18 months for that. That seems like a long time, but it'll be here before you know it. Let's get that done. I'm not trying to push off the regulatory bit. We need that as well, but we're trying to work hand in glove with them.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? There's one here. We can get a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John Mercer at KC Fantasy Court Chambers. The issues of financial sustainability and proper ownership could also be imposed on other domestic sports like rugby or cricket. We've had clubs going under. And so what is it about football that makes it so special that it should have its own government regulator? And is this therefore the thin end of the wedge that exactly the same points could be raised across other sports on a professional basis domestically?
Well, if I can, I mean, I agree with that. It's my view that if the independent regulator of football gets off the ground and isn't a complete disaster, and I think both of those things are likely, then it will be a slow creep for other sports because, you know, Nick has spoken about football being a community asset. Well, in a lot of towns and cities, a local rugby league club in the north or rugby union club elsewhere is also a part of the community, as are cricket clubs and so on. And in fact, the state of the finances in those other sports are far worse, far more perilous than in football. So the reason for it extends across other sports, and I think if you see it work in I call football the national sport. It's the most popular sport. The reason it will be in football first is because of all of those things, and because there is far more money in football than any of those other sports. But that just means that football is leading the way in this area. And if it's a success, I would expect it to expand across other sports.
There's a lot more noise around football as well, full stop, isn't there? Media noise, media journalists put on football as well. There's just a lot more around that. Just wanted to ask you actually about the European Super League, which Jane touched on. And really, that was stopped by fan power, wasn't it? There were a huge number of demonstrations, and football fans just frankly said, over my dead body, do you break away just a very few small little cabal of clubs whose executives have got together behind closed doors and thought this was a great idea to make more money for us away from everybody else. How does that work in conjunction with any kind of regulation?
Yeah, I think that it's especially important for those of us who are lawyers not to overestimate our own importance, because the reason the European Super League failed, as you've said, is because there was not the market for it. That was the reason, and the fan protests in England in particular. It wasn't a legal issue, and Jane's quite right to point out the significance of the case in the European Court of Justice and a number of other similar cases that we have seen. But essentially, if there is, and there may well be in the future, a market for a breakaway, the law will follow that. It won't determine it, it will follow it. In the same way as the Premier League broke away from the Football League when it did and set itself up as a breakaway league, the Football League and the FA tried to stop it. They were unable to stop it, and they reached the historic compromise we're still living under. If there is a demand for it in the market, it will happen, and the law will follow rather than lead, in my view, as it always does in sport.
There is a concern, though, because in response to the European Super League, of course, UEFA has brought through reforms which seen the Swiss model and the expansion of the Champions League and its club competitions. So we've now got 3 UEFA club competitions, and we can't ignore the impact that that is having on a domestic basis. The number of match nights each season that are being taken by UEFA. And Kieran, you'll probably tell me if I'm wrong, but I would have thought that UEFA is probably the biggest confederation in world football, making money every year, as opposed to FIFA making money every few years. And its move onto midweek nights is massive. So yes, the European Super League was killed, but the reality is that UEFA's response to that is causing massive issues on a domestic basis throughout the whole of Europe, not just in England as well. And so, you know, those challenges are there. And of course, the clubs that participate in UEFA competition generate more revenues, which creates a gap in the middle of the Premier League, and all that flows down, and that's why we're here today.
And just very finally, because we've barely got a minute left, Kieran, just to finish with you. I mean, I'm a Wolverhampton Wanderers supporter, not a glory hunter, born and bred, not a glory hunter, okay. But our local community is AFC Wimbledon, and which has grown from scratch in the very, very, very lower reaches of non-league football, and has had to become a Phoenix club after it was taken away and moved to Milton Keynes. It was a huge story at the time. I don't know if you remember that. It effectively became a franchise of football. Do you think that was a complete one-off and can never happen again, or any of you, in fact? Do you think legally that could happen again, any of you? Or do you think maybe morally it could never happen again because of fan power, and since we've had social media and there'd be more of a mobilisation of the football fan world against it, do you think?
Never say never in football, but I think if you look at one of the potential powers of the regulator is to have greater engagement with fans. So therefore, it would have to be with some form of approval. Now, that could be through carrot or stick from the owner's perspective. We've been talking about rugby. We talk about Bury Football Club being destroyed. We talk about Macclesfield Town Football Club being destroyed. Nobody mentions Worcester Warriors or London Irish or Wasps. And why not? I think it's due to the dominance of football. So at grassroots level, clubs moving around, I think would be very difficult. It's not the same as an NFL franchise because it's, as Nick's been saying, it's so embedded in the local community. My identity is through my football club, and it's not necessarily a good thing because I should identify myself in a far broader sense, but the first thing I ask somebody when I go to a wedding, and we're trying to introduce what football team do you support, and if they say I don't like football, I've got nothing to talk about for the next 3 hours.
You and me both, my friend.
But I think, Jackie, after that happened, and some of the guys might know better than me, the FA immediately changed its rules so it couldn't happen again.
No, it was left to league rules.
Is it legal? But it's in the rule book, and this
Yes.
is another example of where we quoted examples that happened in the long distant past. This was a terrible thing to happen, which it was. The regulator will sort it. And I'm like, hang on, there's so much cognitive dissonance going on here because football has already sorted it, and it would be against football's regulations. So anyway, it won't happen again, to answer your question. Short
Hopefully
answer.
it will never happen again. It's an absolute shambles. Thank you so much to all of our esteemed panellists. Thank you so much for your time, for your expertise. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we're not